I think Trump, who fancies himself winning a Nobel Peace Prize, would like to reach a grand bargain, as it were, with Putin. That is, Ukraine is just a stepping stone.
Hello and welcome to the Americano show. Today I am delighted to be joined by Jacob Heilbrunn, who is editor of the National Interest and a much appreciated Spectator contributor and columnist. And we are going to be talking about whether Vladimir Putin has played Donald Trump, because I'm reading that Donald Trump has been played quite a lot. And Jacob, you have written a piece for The Spectator, the headline of which is Putin agrees to the bare minimum to placate Trump. Do you think that it really was the bare minimum? Could Putin have been even more obstinate in his concessions?
Well, first of all, Freddie, I should like to welcome you to our shores here. I'm glad to see that you made it through
I
customs and
should
immigration unscathed.
I should say, yeah, I'm in New York. I'm enjoying the golden age.
It's certainly begun with a bang. The Putin-Trump colloquy was much anticipated here, but I don't think it delivered what Trump wanted. If you watch the interview that he did on Fox News last night with Laura Ingraham, he was dodging a little bit because basically Putin did not agree to the ceasefire that Trump had said would be easy to accomplish. Instead, he indicated that he would cease missile attacks on infrastructure and energy. But of course, within an hour or a couple hours of speaking with Trump, the Russians then launched another fusillade of attacks that included hospitals and energy infrastructure in Ukraine. So I think Trump is discovering both in the Middle East and in Ukraine that his promises of peace in our time are becoming difficult to fulfill.
Well, yes, and it's interesting you mentioned the Middle East because it seems to me that Putin and Trump didn't just talk about Ukraine. They clearly talked about Iran too. Both the White House and the Kremlin have confirmed that they agreed that Iran should never get nuclear weapons. And I believe they talked about intensifying pressure on Tehran, which is quite significant given Putin's friendship with Iran over the years. Do you think, to a certain extent, Trump has accepted that Putin really does have all the leverage when it comes to Ukraine at the moment? He appears to be winning the war. Certainly, without massive American support, Ukraine is likely to crumble. And so, therefore, he is trying to extract concessions in the Middle East for a sort of bigger deal, a bigger peace bargain in the Holy Land, and a sort of perhaps a more significant one for more countries.
Well, there's an interesting piece on Trump today. As you may know, he has appointed himself the head of the Kennedy Center here, the cultural arts institution in Washington, D.C. And in a meeting with his handpicked board a day or so ago, he reminisced about why Cats was his favorite musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber from the 1980s. Trump lives mentally, culturally, and politically in the 1980s. That was the era in which Ronald Reagan struck sweeping accords with Mikhail Gorbachev, and we saw the dissolution ultimately of the Soviet Union. I think Trump, who fancies himself winning a Nobel Peace Prize, would like to reach a grand bargain, as it were, with Putin. That is, Ukraine is just a stepping stone. He would like a sweeping arms control deals with Russia. He would like economic deals, American investment in Russia, particularly for its resources. And ultimately, the idea is that he can pull what's being called a reverse Kissinger, which is to detach Russia from the Chinese orbit. Now, how practical any of this is another question. But as always, President Trump thinks big.
Mm. Well, 7 years ago, almost exactly, I think it was actually 7 years ago today, Trump decided that he wanted to have a call with Putin to congratulate him on his re-election. And then the following day, they had the call, March 20th. And Trump was under strict instructions to not congratulate. His national security advisors told him not to congratulate Putin on his re-election. But of course, Trump completely ignored that and congratulated Putin on his re-election and invited him to Washington, which went down very badly in national security circles, both in London and in America, because Putin had just apparently, according to British intelligence, the Kremlin had ordered the Salisbury Novichok attack. But what struck me reading about that call 7 years ago was how different things are now. And that no national security advisor, I can't imagine Mike Waltz writing any such bossy note to Putin, to Donald Trump. I can't imagine him saying, do not do this. So to some extent, Trump has become a more Putin-esque figure. He is not beholden to the establishment in the way that he was.
Actually, I think Trump may have more maneuvering room than Putin does because there are various factions in the Kremlin and in Russian society that Putin has to deal with. Whereas here we have a Republican Party that has prostrated itself before Trump. And the only real barrier to Trump's authoritarian ambitions is the judiciary, which he is targeting as well.
Mm,
So, and Trump does seem to be displaying Putin-esque tendencies, the idea of annexing Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal. He is definitely flexing his muscles and has a vision that was absent in the first term. Now, part of
mm,
it is that he knows that he has to come up with something new almost every day to keep the attention focused on himself and to keep his base happy. So
mm,
far, Trump has done a brilliant job of that.
mm. And do you think the call with Putin, from what you're saying, you don't think Trump got what he wanted? Do you think there will be animosity there now? We are going to see these talks are resuming in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And we will see, I think Rubio and Waltz will be over there talking to the Russians. Um, do you think we might see a breakdown in the seemingly friendly approach of Russia and America in light of that phone call? Or do you think the American side are just going to press on, accepting that Russia isn't giving them much?
Well, right now, I think Trump is doing everything in his power to accommodate Russian sensitivities, including, as I noted in the piece for you, he yesterday, he has terminated American government support for a Yale program that was tracking the tens of thousands of children that Russia has abducted from Ukraine. So it's not as though Trump isn't moving heaven and earth to try and bolster relations by any means necessary with the Kremlin. Now, even so, the Russians are very tough negotiators. We'll see how the call goes today between Trump and Zelensky, who are talking later today. I don't think Trump is ever really going to turn on Russia. I
Mm,
think he has a psychological bond with the country that dates from the 1980s. And his wives have all come from Eastern Europe as well. So he really feels an affinity with Putin, which he mentioned the other day too, when he said that he and Putin had both survived the so-called Russia hoax together. So there is a bond there. Now, this flabbergasts many Europeans. I was just in Amsterdam and I was in Germany for the elections. And I think Europeans are only beginning to comprehend that Trump prefers to work with autocrats rather than with democracies. There was a statement again I think yesterday on Fox, where he talked about how good his relations are with North Korea, China, and Russia, that he likes the leaders of those countries.
Mm. But I mean, he does have a sort of point in thinking that a lot of multilateral institutions are not very good at achieving their objectives. And he has a better shot of doing it than, say NATO. I mean, NATO, for all the support, for all the bluster, yes, they've stopped Russia walking through Ukraine, arguably, but the war is not being won. And NATO deterrence hasn't worked to that extent.
Disagree, because Ukraine was not a member of NATO, and Putin on his own decided to launch a revanchist war, which he thought he could win within a week. And then it turned into his version of the Second Iraq War for the United States. It became something of a fiasco. The Biden administration had it armed Ukraine sufficiently at the outset when the Ukrainians were making big gains, probably could have helped you or ensured a Russian defeat in Ukraine. It didn't happen for reasons of realpolitik, which were that the Biden administration didn't want to run the risk of the collapse of Russia as a sovereign entity, or watch Putin being overthrown and replaced by, who knows, perhaps an even more authoritarian leader. So that didn't happen. I reject your defeatism. I think the Ukrainians have essentially fought the Russians to a standstill. And that if, and Europe, Germany, France are all mobilizing right now to ensure that Ukraine is not left in the lurch, as well as the Baltic states. I think Ukraine really is pivotal in this instance. That we cannot just walk out of there and allow Putin to seize its resources and manpower. By
Mm.
contrast, I think that the Trump administration is making a mistake in the Middle East, becoming further enmeshed in the conflicts there as the war in the Gaza Strip spreads and as we are deploying our military to target the Houthis. That seems to me like a true squandering of American military power.
Well, I don't think I'm defeatist. I think we're probably realist because I don't see what defeat of Russia would have looked like. Let's say that Ukraine had pushed all Russian forces with massive support from massive and instant support from the West, had pushed all Russian forces out of Ukraine. Do we think Russia, Putin would have accepted, or even the people around Putin would have accepted that defeat? Or do we think, no, they would have just gone back and back and back, and they have the manpower, the resources, they are a much bigger country than Ukraine, and they would not have given up. I don't realistically see how Ukraine could have defeated Russia without actual Western military involvement, which was never really on the cards.
I disagree. I think the red line for Putin would have been Crimea, that had Ukrainian forces attempted to liberate Crimea, that then he would have turned to tactical nuclear weapons. But up to that point, no. I mean, let's face it, the Ukrainians actually invaded sovereign Russian territory in Kursk, and Putin did not escalate. He has proven to be quite cautious overall in responding to the West's aid to Ukraine. Another measure that Putin obviously has taken is to foment terrorist activity inside Europe. These plans for putting bombs on planes, targeting EU officials and for assassination and so forth. But he has not he has not actually used tactical nuclear weapons. I think we could have stopped the Russian invasion of the Ukrainian territories.
Mm. Well, I don't think uh, that Putin's reluctance to escalate the conflict is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think it's probably quite gratifying that Russia isn't escalating towards nuclear war because it could have done.
Well, the cost would have been immense. I mean, yes, obviously he could and can, but the Chinese have made it ex abundantly clear that they don't want nuclear missiles being launched willy-nilly. And
Mm.
I don't think Putin wants to take that risk. To that extent, the Cold War rules have held.
Do you think that like a lot of people say that now Xi Jinping will be emboldened to take Taiwan because he can see that the West won't stand up to an aggressive superpower?
Emboldened, yes. Will he actually embark upon an invasion of Taiwan, or will he seek to use a tourniquet? I would think that he would be more likely to try and blockade Taiwan than to want to launch an invasion. The Chinese have not been in a military conflict since their invasion of Vietnam in 1978, which was a debacle. And, we know as early as Thucydides that these sort of expeditions, the Sicilian expedition turned into a disaster for the Athenians. They were wildly overconfident.
Mm.
Uh, Taking Taiwan, assaulting it, uh, is not a no-brainer for the Chinese. They would obviously like to coerce it into submission. And I'm not sure that Trump himself would have huge reservations about China incorporating Taiwan. I think Trump's ambition is to leave the region, to pull American troops from South Korea and to force the Japanese to rearm.
Mm. Well, having spent some time recently in Europe, what do you make of this Macron-Starmer idea? Emmanuel Macron, French president, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, of a coalition of the willing. I think it's an unfortunate phrase. And I mean, I think it seems to me that Russia's never going to accept a kind of European force with British troops in particular. It would be anti the idea of British troops operating in Europe, and it is potentially a trigger point to a very serious conflict between Europe and Russia. And Donald Trump doesn't seem to be interested in providing the security backstop that Keir Starmer is offering. What do you make of this European plan?
I have come away from several weeks in Europe feeling more bullish about the continent, primarily because incoming German Chancellor Friedrich Merz managed to overcome the debt brake in Germany, which had crippled spending. And he successfully persuaded the German federal parliament yesterday, including the Greens, to back a 500 billion euro package for infrastructure and rebuilding the German army. Meanwhile, Macron is talking about revitalizing an air base near the border with Germany. Uh, I think Putin and to some degree Trump may regret having reanimated the Europeans as an independent force because it is increasingly clear to Macron and to Merz and to other European leaders that they're on their own. They can, in fact, no longer rely on the United States. However, that does attenuate the American ability to influence Europe and to use it for power projection into the Middle East, for example. So,
Mm,
and for Putin, the idea that Poland is going to get nuclear weapons, that the nuclear umbrella will be extended to Germany, that perhaps more nuclear weapons will be stationed in Germany. I don't see how any of this redounds to the benefit of Russian national security. Now, as to the Starmer Macron, I don't know what's actually going to develop as far as a ceasefire. There may not be a ceasefire for another year. I think
Mm.
the Russians eventually will accede to an agreement. But right now, Putin is slowly advancing and thinks that he has the whip hand. So there really is no cogent reason for him to stop fighting. But given the bloodletting, the increased Ukrainian ability to manufacture their own arms, I think that if we have the staying power and continue to support Ukraine, that there will be a ceasefire in say 6 months to a year that will be more agreeable to the Ukrainians and to the Western Europeans. Now, whether there's going to be a couple thousand European troops as part of that in Ukraine, no, I wouldn't rule it out.
Well, I mean, what you're talking about there is World War Three, isn't it not? I mean, that would
No, it's
mean
not
Russia
World War III.
fighting.
It's the
It would
opposite
mean why not? Why is it the opposite? I mean, it'd be Russia
because
fighting.
there's
Uh,
any number of paths you can take here. You could move for some kind of Austrian solution where, as we had in 1955, where Austria is a neutral power. You could have that status for Ukraine.
yeah,
Um,
but the
from
Russians would be happy
45
with that.
onwards, we had the four powers in Berlin until really 1989, actually. Berlin, I mean, was divided into four zones.
Mm.
Um, so I don't know. The Russians have lived with this before. I don't know. I think Macron was right. Ukraine is a sovereign country. If they want to have French and British troops on their soil, they're allowed to.
Well, on that dangerous note, I think we'll end it there. But Jacob, thank you very much for coming to Americano. It's always interesting to hear your Trump skeptical perspective.
Well, I'm Trump interested, and it's a delight to be on Americano and to welcome you to America.
Thanks, Jacob. All the best.